Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jackie Martin, toko ingoa. I am a member of the IABC Aotearoa New Zealand board, and I'd like to welcome you all to our July event. Welcome to all of the IABC members, the PRINZ members, and everybody else who's not a member but would love to be one, I'm sure. We've got a really, really interesting topic today, a very topical topic. A lot of people have expressed interest in this. When brands should speak up or shut up on social issues. And I am joined today by three really, really fascinating, interesting, very knowledgeable people in this area. So joining us from across the ditch is Danielle Bond, who is the Group Director, Brand Marketing and Communications at Aurecon, and also the Chair of IABC internationally. She's our big boss for IABC. Danielle is an award-winning marketing executive with expertise in the professional services sector. She's a member of the IABC's Victoria chapter. She served as an evaluator for the IABC Gold Quill Awards for several years, and she joined the International Executive Board in 2019. And brand strategy is her passion and her strength. It's what she's all about. So thank you very much for making the time for us from across the ditch, Danielle. It's lovely to have you here.
Kia ora, lovely to be here.
And also with us, we have Professor Debashish Munshi. He is Professor of Management Communication at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. His research interests lie at the intersections of communication, diversity, sustainability, social change, and citizenship. So absolutely the man for this topic. His most recent co-authored book is Public Relations and Sustainable Citizenship, Representing the Unrepresented. And it won the International Communication Association Public Relations Division's Outstanding Scholarly Book Award in 2022. So thank you very much for joining us. We're really looking forward to your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And finally, we have Kaz Carter, who's probably known to many of you around town. You've probably read her columns and stuff from time to time. She has an extensive background in corporate communications, public relations, and marketing. What we now talk about as the portfolio career, which is what everybody's going for. She has just been appointed GM at Te Whaia, the home of the National Schools of Dance and Drama and other performing arts. So it will make a very interesting background for this whole topic. She is working on the Mind the Gap campaign. And for those of you who joined us earlier this year when we spoke to Joe Cribb, who's also involved in Mind the Gap, very, very topical right now. That's on reducing New Zealand's pay gap. And she's also Director of Marketing and Communications company, Kaz Carter Communications. So thank you all very much for making the time to join us to discuss this. I think, we don't have to go very far to find when brands have really, really, I'll say they tried to do the right thing, but got it so very wrong, or didn't, jumped on that bandwagon, boots and all, and suddenly found themselves, face first in the mud pool behind it. Whether it's Pride Month, International Women's Day, Black Lives Matter, people are getting called out more and more on this topic, and when they're doing it right and when they're doing it wrong. So what do you think are some of the biggest mistakes brands are making when they are getting involved in this? And Danielle, I'll go to you first. From your experience, what do you think in this area?
Well, we have a very current example of this happening in Sydney, Australia this week with one of our football teams that are competing in the national league, and they run a pride round, and this particular football club committed to wearing pride jerseys during the round, but unfortunately 7 of their players had declined to play wearing the pride jerseys, and the CEO has had to come out to apologise for a poorly executed idea. And for me, the key takeaway of this particular issue was this chief executive hadn't really spent the time, I don't think, anticipating what his stakeholders' response to their position on wearing and celebrating Pride Month, which is close to the heart of many organisations and businesses and individuals in Australia. But he seemed to be taken by surprise that some of his key stakeholders, being some of his players, had a serious issue with wearing the jersey. So it's been a pretty tough week for that chief executive, that club, and for lots of stakeholders. So I think the key takeaway for me is be prepared. What is your strategy for taking this position? Have you thought through the implications of the position that you're taking with your stakeholders, and are you ready for any potential fallout? Because there will always be a stakeholder or a group of stakeholders who may not agree with your position, but you need to be sure that that is in fact the stand you're wanting to take. To their credit, they're continuing to play. They're going to wear the Pride jerseys. Perhaps a sweetener for the club is that the Pride jerseys have in fact sold out, with NFL fans across the country wanting to get their Manly Sea Pride jersey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Debashish, from your experience, if you were talking to your students about this and how they might get involved in this area, and where they can have a voice and actually be the conscience of an organization, what would you be asking them to think about in a situation like this? What would you be asking them to be aware of?
Okay, so before I respond to your question, I'd like to clarify up front that I'm actually not a marketing researcher, nor am I a professional communications practitioner. My work, area of work is not about fine-tuning strategies for promoting or maintaining brand image, really. So I'm more of a critical researcher, and I'm more interested in corporate social responsibility, especially investigating the lack of it and whether corporate communications are aligned with the larger social, cultural, environmental values of the planet that we live in. Now, briefly to respond to your question, and also picking up from what Danielle is saying, ultimately it is about authenticity, really. If you're seen to put out a fake expression of solidarity with a marginalized group, you will be put under scrutiny. And research has shown that millennials and Gen Z customers or consumers have very high expectations of brands to fulfill core social and environmental values. And this demographic can be particularly unforgiving if a brand is seen to be some kind of an imposter. Again, if I take just a couple of more minutes to say that in a sense, I don't quite focus as much on the mistakes brands might make in jumping on the bandwagons of the day as we are talking about. Because the word mistakes, to me, has kind of a benign ring to it. So for me, I'm more interested in investigating carefully curated, manipulative strategies that amount to blatant image washing, right? Mm-hmm. So that's my focus when brands are deliberately using tactics to wash their image. And so for me, even picking up on the book that you referred to, if we take the classic case of fossil fuel companies, for instance, now that there is a growing concern about climate change, some of these companies who at one time, used to openly deny climate change are now actually using more subtle forms of appropriating the discourse. Mm-hmm. And we in our book have called it climate washing in some sense. So we've all heard about greenwashing, for instance, where corporations promote their green credentials, but continue to inflict damage on the environment through their actions on the ground. All the fossil fuel companies, and pretty much all of them really, are doing this in one way or the other. They talk about investing in renewables in their ads, public statements. They hold events, where they're talking about, how the climate crisis is really a major problem and we need to do something. But at the same time, they continue drilling, or even more controversially, fracking for oil. Now, for me, this is clearly hypocritical, and it's not just a mistake. but a deliberate attempt to mislead the public. And so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it's, and that's actually quite topical, because there was a discussion this morning on the radio. I don't know if everybody's heard this, but the Financial Markets Authority here in New Zealand has actually come out and said, for all of these funds that are marketing themselves as sustainable funds, actually, how sustainable are you? We need to have common measures. We need to stop misleading investors about, what's actually happening. So, they're all essentially on notice to stop greenwashing your funds in the hopes that it actually gets more people to buy into this. And this is the really interesting question. I mean, Kaz, with the work that you're doing with Mind the Gap, it's really interesting discourse, because you are calling out behaviours that are happening here in New Zealand a lot. So if you think of it from both sides, with the hat that you used to wear when you would have been in-house working to protect the brand of an organisation, but now you're actually going along and saying, no, come on, we need to lift our game. How does it feel? How does it play out? What are you expecting to see from some people?
Yeah, it's interesting that jumping to the other side like that and putting pressure, and it's quite a sort of a unique environment, I suppose. And I think also you see in the time I've worked in this field that values have changed a lot, and we've got to keep up all the time. And I often actually check things with my children who are like 20 and 22, because the values are different. How does this look? How does it look from your perspective? So from Mind the Gap's perspective, working with businesses, it has actually been a joy. There's been a whole lot of businesses who are really keen to work with this. I think a little bit like, in a smaller way, like the climate change and greenwashing issue, I think that businesses need to come with it with humility. So what happens with us with Mind the Gap is often businesses will go, oh yeah, I'll register my pay gap. It'll be hardly anything. We do really well. We've got lots of women on our board and on our executive. And then they actually measure the gap and they find that it's actually quite big. And then they're like, oh no. So it's actually, I guess it comes back to actually doing your research first before you start talking about it. As Danielle said, in that case, do your research, see where you're at, and actually come with it when you're talking about it with some sense of humility as well, that we're not perfect, but we're trying. And that's what we've been trying to say in Mind the Gap is this is the first step. We're not going to close a giant pay gap in the next year, but we've got to work towards something, and let's work towards it together. But do it in a humble way, because if you say we're great, we're perfect, we've got no issues, you'll be called out for sure.
Yeah. So actually, and this is one of the areas that I think so that as Debashish says, there's an issue with the misleading elements of some of the areas that some organizations and their brands jump into. So where you're an energy company and you're coming out on climate change, but your behaviors are still acting the same way. So Danielle, if you're an organization, how do you make the decisions about what causes you stand behind and what causes you go, look, that's not actually us, and there are good reasons why we shouldn't be involved in this, or there are good reasons why we don't, we know that we have work to do in this area and we don't want to put up our hand and because everybody will have their causes, everybody will have things that they want you to talk about, but it's not always appropriate. So how do you go about working that out?
I think there's probably three questions the organisation has to ask itself, the brand has to ask itself, if brand indeed can be a sentient being. Does the position that we're wanting to take align with our organisational purpose, our organisational / business strategy, our values? So is it a fit? Essential to that, you've got to ask yourself the question, are we doing something about this social issue as an organisation? To Kaz's point, Mind the Gap. Don't take a position on equal pay unless you actually are doing something about ensuring that your organisation and brand is genuinely addressing that. So it might align with your organisational strategy and purpose, but you've also got to be doing something. So at the World Conference in New York, there was a really significant conversation that happened across the 3 days, which was the importance of organisations closing that say-do gap. So, in fact, you should start with do. Do first, then you can say. But the opportunity for communication professionals is to help our organisations close that gap. That's the space in which we play. So that's about the integrity and authenticity that we were speaking of. And you've also got to, I think, have asked yourself the question, who are my stakeholders? And what will us taking a position on this mean to them? Our employees, our investors, our customers, the broader community. And they're often all stakeholders of most organisations. So it's not a black and white. It's not a binary decision. You've got to work through that process, I think, to determine what are the social issues. And I really think you should do that work up front. When you're finding yourselves in the fear of missing out, taking a position on a hot topic, but you haven't done that thinking, don't dive into the pool. You should really have thought about these positions as part of your organisational strategy, and you should have, I think, an evolved and well thought through position.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that, actually, because I think it's something that we get a lot of pressure on us as communications people within an organisation, is that, it's the classic one where your boss comes up and says, I want you to make something that will go viral, and you're like, okay, fine, I'll just do that in the next 5 minutes. But it's also that, oh, look, somebody comes in, it's one of your colleagues, and they say, this is happening, why don't you do something around this? And you get a lot of pressure, and it's actually holding your line and actually remembering, as Danielle says, you're ultimately building a brand, and what you're doing in your social media or what you're doing in terms of working with other brands is all part of a long-term strategy. And if you don't do your research, if you don't make sure it's relevant to your organization, you risk losing trust in your audience if your content isn't relevant to them, or if you've made a big risk. And as we know, once you lose that trust and that reputation, it's years to get it back again. And every time someone Googles you, that story is going to come up again. So it's quite risky.
Yeah. Debashish, I'd like your thoughts around, this area of where where you've seen brands or organizations get involved in this and they haven't thought it through. So that we'll talk about it as reputational risk, but that risk of that, the washing of these things. And what does it do for those people who are actually, invested in this? So if you're talking about, where you talked about, energy companies putting their hand up saying, yeah, we're doing a lot for the climate, but what does it actually then do on the opposite side for those who are climate activists and the reaction that they're going to have, that whole polarizing of the views that start to emerge?
Okay, I'll start with the word that you used, polarizing. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. And again, I'll pick up on something that Danielle said. I like what she was talking about, do first and then say. So, the align, does your position align with your own values? Now, one of the things that I do find is that when a brand takes a position, you have to be certain that it is going to be polarizing, because, we live in a world now that if you take a position, there's going to be some pushback from somebody else. And so, and especially we see, many of us, for instance, who subscribe to progressive liberal views, we find that if we make a statement that is progressive, there'll be a whole lot of people who are on the, shall we say, for want of another word, the conservative spectrum, are likely to, strike back. And so, for instance, if a brand promotes, something, which is anti-racist or anti-sexist, or, in favor of transgender communities, there will almost always be another kind of group that will try and say boycott those products because whatever. And so we've seen that happen so many times. For instance, even with big brands like Nike, for instance, when they came up with the Colin Kaepernick kind of stuff, and there was a whole lot of people who said that we'll burn those shoes kind of stuff. So you have to. Now the thing is that if an issue is polarized, and anything controversial is almost always polarized, brand messages will inevitably earn kudos from some and outrage another, right? So that's the reality of it all. But if a brand identifies with progressive values, it should speak out in support of those values, no matter what opponents say, right? So it's always useful to do a bit of research. And again, as Danielle and Cass were both saying, to see what target audience the brand most aligns with. And so even if there is a backlash from some other groups, the brand still lives up to its standing with its core audience, right? Because hasty U-turns or withdrawals almost always affect the credibility of brands. And credibility alongside authenticity is a key word in what we are discussing today, because from an ethical standpoint, professionals must first consider, whether the position they're taking is credible or not. So what is the intention of the post or the comment or the campaign that they wish to initiate? Is it an attempt to present an image of social responsibility, or is the brand truly committed to the words that they craft for a post or a campaign? So again, in other words, again, as some of my colleagues have been saying, do the words align with the organization's actions on the ground? And I personally feel that authenticity is almost always rewarded in the long run. And if I might add just one other thing, is that when a brand makes a particular post or position, one of the things also is from the organization's point of view, that if it is just something that you're saying and you've not really involved the entire organization in those values or ethics, you will stand to lose. Because, for example, have you made sure that the rank and file of the brand owning organization is fully cognizant of the values that the brand represents, and that any post or campaign is unlikely to be undermined by ill-informed managers and employees, for instance. And you don't want that kind of disjuncture.
Thinking about corporate social responsibility, this entire area, which essentially this is what it is. What does it mean to be a good corporate, living in society, working and providing for everybody? I remember years ago when I first got involved in this area, it was one of these things. Everybody was. It was a nice thing. It was a gentle thing. But I don't think anybody spoke out more. Whereas now, when you look at it, and Debashish, I'd really like your opinion on this one. Do you think that it has actually, we've used the word polarizing, which is quite a strong word, but do you think emotions have become a lot higher in this area? It's now more, it is more charged, and, people speak out more. They're much more radicalized almost in some areas around these things.
I definitely think so. And one of the things that has changed from the earlier times when I was much younger, academic, for instance, is the influence of social media. And that has definitely brought about a huge change. And again, associated with social media, and I did mention this before, that I think millennials and Gen Z people are much more active, and many of them do have very progressive values, and they want the brands that they want to kind of promote, to share those values. And so therefore the passion is definitely much stronger. And of course the reverse is also true, that when passion breaks out, there will be other kinds of forces that will oppose it. And so so we do definitely see a lot of this. And so, some brands, for instance, the term brand activism has also been used quite a bit, that some brands are actually going into the activism space because they feel that, their constituencies would actually like them to take up those positions. And so So yeah, I do think that it's, the world itself is a lot more polarized now. People are speaking up, and brands are keeping pace with what's happening. But the thing, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say, like Kaz and Danielle, from your perspectives as communicators within organisations, I mean, organisations speak up on topics a lot more than they ever used to. I mean, in the past, CSR, you'd stick out a very nice CSR in your report at the end of the year, and that was kind of all you really did, and you do a few things. But now, an organisation takes a stand on things, and, they are more vocal. But how does this... there's still that very risk-averse nature about getting involved in some areas. How do you strike that balance, when you've got your stakeholders actually asking you to be more involved in this area?
If I was just going to sort of jump in following that conversation, just from a Mind the Gap perspective, that we've looked extensively at what other countries are doing around their pay gaps. And what we've found in the research is that by companies actually registering their pay gaps, acknowledging they have a pay gap and talking about what they're going to do about it, so not having solved it, but just doing something, it actually has an impact on consumers. So consumers will actually say, I prefer to buy from this company than this, even if I'm paying more, because I can see that you're taking responsibility around the pay gap. The other thing is in terms of staff as well, that people will say that they will choose one employer over another because they have consciously looked at their pay gap and are doing some work around it. So it does actually have like a commercial imperative. And also in this time where the job market's so hot, you want to be thinking about all those things when you're trying to bring in new employees and potential employees. You need to be thinking about those sort of things. But sort of the other thing, just in a sort of answer to your question, I've been thinking of all these examples of what's gone right and wrong with things, and I still go back to, it's long, very old now, but the Dove campaign, around women's bodies and bodies can be in all shapes and all those sort of things. I just remember that at the time when that was launched, my daughter was quite young, and I was just like, hallelujah. And they had those wonderful videos of the people being made up and what they look like when in the normal, and then they fast forward to showing all the makeup and everything they do at the other end. And I just thought that was an incredibly relevant to Dove. Relevant because their market was mostly women, but they took a giant step forward from any other company in terms of saying, let's be real and let's be role models in being real for the younger generation. And I thought that was spot on when they did that.
I mean, I agree. I think the Dove campaign is relevant. That's the word that you used. I think it's a fantastic position for a beauty brand to take, and it set. I mean, it kicked off a conversation that had an industry-wide impact, which is powerful, and congratulations to them. I'd just like to be a little bit conservative though around relevance. I don't think brands should be taking positions on every social issue. I think you run the risk of trivializing your contribution to those social issues where you can be relevant and where it's you have something that you can contribute that's meaningful if you take a position on everything. So I do think brands will want to take some sensible steps of really thinking about, can I add value to this conversation? Is my organisation in a position to contribute to creating a more diverse and inclusive environment across my industry? Can my organisation contribute to solving some of the problems businesses have created in climate and sustainability? If I can't be that brand, I'd take a step back from taking public positions. I see in the chat colleagues asked the question, do you run the risk of being seen to endorse social injustice? And it's a really good question to ask. So I just, again, taking the comms perspective, if I felt this issue was really important to my workforce, even if I didn't think it was necessarily an issue that my organisation or brand could make a meaningful contribution to, I'd acknowledge that internally. I'd talk about that internally. I'd listen internally. I wouldn't be taking necessarily a public position. So I think it's horses for courses. Not everything has to be tweetable. In fact, the most credible brands are the ones that are doing the work, in my opinion. And I suspect if you look at Edelman Trust Barometer, it's pointing us in the direction of saying we're going to be consumers, employees, and your point, Jackie, about what even the investor community is setting expectations to say, it's all very well to, care and to say you care and it's important, but I want to know how you're going to make a difference. What are you doing to shift the dial?
Yeah. Go ahead, Debashish.
I just wanted to pick up on the word trivialize that Danielle said, and that's so right. And of course, there's so many examples of brands trying to jump onto the bandwagon and in the end actually trivializing the matter rather than adding any solid contribution to that. And probably the best known example from recent times is the Pepsi thing, for instance, for the Black Lives Matter. They got Kendall Jenner and that whole imaginary, ostensibly to support the movement, but it backfired because they seem the very use of the imagery seemed to trivialize the protests, and of course Pepsi very quickly withdrew the ad as well. So that's definitely a major risk, because if you are seen to trivialize something that you purportedly supporting, then again it affects the authenticity.
I mean, if you stand for everything, perhaps you stand for nothing, right?
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah. So what are some examples of organizations that do actually do this really well, that do the doing and then say that they're doing it at the right moments and on the right things? What have you found in your research, Debashish, when you've been looking in this area?
Well, so as I was trying to say right in the beginning that, I don't really study brands or any such thing. So my research has been primarily to reimagine public relations, in a very, very different way. So, basically take it out of its commonly associated locales of corporate boardrooms and campaign strategy rooms, influencer-driven social media platforms kind of stuff. So in that sense, so I'm not really examining brands, but what I'm trying to do, and this is probably may not be of interest to people participating today, but what I've been trying to do is to envision a socially responsible version of public relations that puts the planet and its people at the center. So, when you refer to my book, for instance, and if I have if I may be given the indulgence to very, very, very briefly to talk about what the book is about, it's more about So, okay, in a larger sense, public relations is ultimately about representation, right? But the question we ask is that who gets represented? Our ideas are primarily about representing marginalized publics that remain unrepresented in the world of global business and society. So, so what we're doing in the book is we begin by asking if the word public in public relations really means the public at a broad level. And our research, over the years has shown that public relations creates and maintains a hierarchy of publics, ranging from dominant elite publics that relentlessly promoted or not represented, right up to people who are not represented at all. But if public relations does not engage with a multitude of publics or represent the unrepresented, can it ever play a role in grappling with the pressing issues facing our global citizenry right now? And so when we say hierarchy of publics, for instance, when I first started doing this research, and again, this may or may not be of any consequence to you, we were looking at, after the Bhopal crisis of 1984, the the world's biggest industrial disaster, and it still ranks as one of those. The Union Carbide, which owned the company, was still described in very prominent public relations textbooks as a PR success. And that's how actually I got into, I mean, if I were to say how I got into this research in the first place, it struck me as how can an incident which led to 20,000 people dying and hundreds of thousands being maimed, how can it be called a success story by any yardstick, right? And the only yardstick that was being used is that the share values of the company didn't fall. And so that made me question that, who are really the publics? I mean, if the publics are the shareholders or the people who buy the products, and it does not include people who live near the factories where the product is actually being manufactured, then is it really public relations? And so, to cut a long story short, that's what I've been doing. And so when I look for examples, so the best examples, actually, there are some examples from the corporate world as well of good citizenship, but the best examples actually come from outside the corporate world. So in our book, for instance, we talk about the relationships and alliances being built by indigenous communities and youth groups to create networks for climate justice. And I see that those kinds of alliances and relationship building that's happening on the ground is really powerful public relations. And, it gives some messages and perhaps some soul searching for people who are more in the corporate world. Sorry if it was a bit of a digression, but yeah.
No, but I think actually that's really important, because we have to turn our thinking about this on its head, really. If we keep thinking, well, like you say, if you're thinking about the public as just this one very small piece, and an organization will say shareholders, very important, help keep us going, but actually, as Kaz said, for Mind the Gap, where an organization says, okay, we are going to get involved, we might not have this sorted right now, but we recognize that it's something that we need to be involved in, and we will address this. It actually brings in all these other areas. The organization can't exist without the employees being there, and it's the employees will choose to be there because they see that it's actually getting involved in the things that matter to them, in the things that will make a difference to them. And as an internal communicator, I have always been a massive advocate of the fact that actually brand is driven from the inside. It's never the external face of that. It is driven by the people and what they do and what they say and how they behave. That actually drives the real brand of an organization. So if you've got the employees in there believing that the organization believes in the right things and says and does what it should do, then that's actually a public group that spreads their influence more widely. Sorry, that's my soapbox. But
you're right, because it also drives pride in your organisation that you're actually doing something. And if you're proud, you're more likely to talk about it and talk about it in a positive way within your own network. So sometimes you can be supporting a social issue without even doing anything externally at all, but it's all internally based, and even things like a lot of organizations do things like, I don't know, coming up with gifts for at Christmas time for people who can't afford them, and it'll just be something that you'll do internally, but it's feel good, it makes you feel good, it's something relevant at that time of the year, but it might not be a big shining light that changes the world in a big way, but it's just an incremental change.
So I agree with all of that totally. But if I put on my business hat, I'm also a business competing, and I need to find a place of difference and differentiation that helps me be successful in the marketplace with my customers. So I agree that brands get built from the inside out, but they also get built from the outside in, and they have to help you engage and win in the market. And that's where I think there is it's really important for communication professionals to work alongside marketing and sales to just make sure that in seeking to carve out a point of difference, and it may be around the position the organisation takes on some of these social issues, that you don't run into that hubris and greenwashing, that you indeed are appropriately cautious about not over-promising. But, I mean, equally as well, you know, I've read a lot of work by marketing professionals who would challenge the value of some of what we've been talking about in terms of winning in the marketplace. A particular shoe company, they shall remain nameless, you know, has taken public positions on some of these issues and done very well, have been called out for an inconsistency in that position in terms of how they run their workforce and supply chain. Didn't impact sales. Sales didn't go down. Sales continued to go up. So that's the real world. I think hopefully strategic alignment will help us get better at this, and consumers will be more astute at making choices around what they will buy based on the behaviours of the brands. That's going to take some time.
I think that's a really good point, actually. I think we've probably got a little bit of time, but by the time that Gen Zs are earning more money, making more decisions, we better get it right, because they are way more discerning, the younger people, and they won't let up if we stumble. So we've got a little bit of time to practice and get it right, but not long.
And there is more choice as well. You know, in the past, we're a great consumer society and we've got way more choice now on all sorts of things, but it means that it is easier for consumers and potential employees and anybody who interacts with an organization to start to choose an alternative. That global shoe company, we all know, very famous one, but a lot of people will still want it because of what it represents. So it might not affect their sales immediately, but incrementally something will come in that is more desirable and that can actually demonstrate that it is living the values a lot more, and appealing more to the values that the public has of whatever state they're in. I think we've done a pretty good job on this, but I'd like to just look at some of the comments that have been coming through from people. And I think, Danielle, I'll be quite interested in your view on this one. It's the question from Heather Claycomb about, is this just a board or exec decision, or would you involve your staff and survey staff as part of your background research when you're actually thinking about what issues does your organisation, get involved in and have a position on and think about addressing?
I certainly think you want to understand what your staff think and feel about issues. So I'd want to know that information. I'd probably still reserve the right for the board and the executive leadership to make the call. That's why they're in those roles, to make those calls. But do understand what your staff sentiment is so that you don't get caught out like our football team in Australia did this week. I was in New York when the Roe v. Wade decision came out, and I was having a conversation with a senior communication professional for one of the largest tech companies and asking them what was the position they take as a company on this. And they had, because there was early notice of the likely decision that would be handed down by the Supreme Court, they had already got themselves organised around the health position that they would take on offering their employees support as part of their employee service around it. They saw it as a health and safety issue, a health and wellbeing issue. But they did know that when they issued that communique to staff, that there would be a sizable proportion reflective of the community position in the United States that were upset about that. So they knew that, and they still decided to proceed and weren't, distracted. They wanted to listen and understand, but they still made the decision. So I think do talk with staff and understand that. But if it's important for your organisation to take a position on this, it doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be a collective vote. That's why leaders, I guess, need to make calls sometimes.
Yeah, and I think, see, that whole Roe v. Wade decision has been a really interesting one to see play out for people, because I mean, that really is the definition of polarizing, isn't it? An issue like that. And what do you do as an organization knowing that there will be people within your company and people watching you from the outside who are going to make very, very strong judgment decisions on that? So where do you stand? How far do you go in an issue like that? Does it become, and actually it's really, it's one of the things a lot of these issues get, because somebody has to stand up and say something about it. And as you said, Danielle, the decisions go to the board and the executive. This becomes almost personalized for some, if a chief executive is the one who has to stand up there and go, this is the position the company is taking on this. This is a position that we are taking as an organization on this issue. And knowing that you suddenly become the face of it for your organization, that's a big, tough thing to do when it's going to upset people so much. It's not the logo that's standing up making that decision.
I mean,
it's a person.
And I could say cheekily, that's why they get paid the big bucks. But it is about, that is why they have to be really sure that they're wanting to take this position, because they will, any leader will expose themselves to that, and perhaps sometimes arguing a case that they don't personally believe in either, right? So challenging, but important in that instance, I think, for their workforce to send a message.
It does also, though, come back to relevance again, doesn't it? Like, this is why we as a company are taking a stand on this issue, because it is relevant to us because of whatever that is. So, I mean, that particular issue is quite fraught, and you'd have to be very brave, but it might be relevant to your product or what you do, your service, that you would take a stand, and then it makes sense. It needs to make sense.
Kaz, from an advocacy side, this is quite interesting, because you're coming from the other side. You're putting the acid on all the rest of us to be involved in things, and
in a nice way.
In a very nice way. But you are. And I mean, you're actually prompting uncomfortable conversations, because, very much the campaign at the moment has been about the chronic underrepresentation in pay terms of Pacifica and Pacifica women. And you guys have come out and you've been very, very honest about this, going, it's not because of qualifications. It's not because of it's actually inherent bias and discrimination. And that's a very, nobody wants that, but you're actually calling that out as a group. How's it, what have you seen and felt from your group's perspective?
One of the things I think that I'd find, because I'm working with a bunch of very passionate people, we're a really small unit, and there's some guys and some women, and different ethnicities, and they're very passionate, and some of them, like Joe Cribb that you talked about before, has been on this case for years. So I've come in more recently with it, and what I have to keep saying to them is, this isn't that easy to understand, and a lot of people come to it thinking it's about the fairness of pay, and so they're saying, no, but for example, a gender difference, they're saying, well, men and women, it's they, if they're doing the same job, they earn the same pay. So we've sorted all that. We've actually had journalists say that to us on live interviews. That legislation is 50 years old this year. In October, it'll be 50 years that they've said that it's no longer legal to pay women are different from men. Since then, we've done very little. So there's all these things that a lot of people, including a lot of businesses and business owners, don't understand. So first of all, there's that actual explanation that this is actually quite complex. And that's why we are working so hard and putting the onus back on businesses, is that every business is different in terms of what their pay gap is and why it is the way it is. And wonderful David McLean that we worked with, who was CEO of Westpac, who's now the chair of Kiwi Rail, and he said he was absolutely stunned when he saw what the pay gap was at Westpac, and then they uncovered it. And he said, well, what they found was that women tended to be on the front line, and so they were in the jobs that paid less, and men tended to be more on IT and on the floor in the bank, which paid more. Which then begs the question, why are you putting the people who are front facing to your customers, why are you paying them less than the others? So there's a whole lot of historical stuff, and so a lot of it is actually explaining. So but I have to say that of anything like this I've ever worked on, this is amazing in terms of the response that we've had, that people are really interested, they're ready for it, and they're ready to try and understand more if they can give us the time to explain it. So and also that from a media perspective, I mean, my job in this whole thing has been to keep the noise going, really, is, you know, just to keep it going. And I've had unbelievably supportive journalists in this space who are just, oh yeah, I want to cover that story. Oh, I totally do. And yes, I'm going to cover it again from this angle. So no, it has been really interesting. People being really open to it, really accepting. Going back to what you said about like Pacifica pay and Māori pay, much harder to work that through with a business, because when you join a business, you're not required to say what the ethnicity you are. You may be asked, but it's not a legal requirement. So it's very hard for businesses to actually do that, to actually work that through. So out of the 55 businesses we've got who've registered their pay gaps, there's only, I think there's about 8 who have actually registering their gaps for Pacifica people and for Māori as well. So that's a harder one to work through. New Zealand is really lagging behind in terms of addressing the pay gap in the Western world. But if we got this right around our Indigenous people and the pay gap there, if we managed to actually change the legislation so we're actually measuring that, we would actually be world leading in terms of that. It's a big issue. So it's a big opportunity for New Zealand if we take it on.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'd like to thank everybody very much for the time that you've given us to talk through this. It's, it's still going to be something that people will stumble in. We've got a long way to go. There's a lot that organisations need to be thinking about in this and what they do and how they, like you said, Debashish, reframe their thinking around all of this. Just look at it in a very different way. Flip the narrative over and go, who are we here to represent? Therefore, what do we represent them on? And what does this actually mean for us? I'm really pleased to see that corporate social responsibility is still very much a thing. It kind of, everybody sort of moved on for a while, but I still like to think that it's there. But the fact that we're starting to get more vocal about it, we're willing to hold organisations to account on these things, is actually really worthwhile, and it's a big step up. Like I said, back in the days when I first ever got involved in it, you stuck out a report once a year and said, well done us, look at us, we're doing a great job. But now we're actually being held to account, and it is the role of us as communications professionals to help get the right voices amplified about what's happening and what we should be doing and what we should be saying, how we should act. Are there any last points that you'd like to make for everybody? Something for them to think about a lot.
Sign our petition.
Yes. Happy to, if I can as an Australian. Look, I would just put the call out to the communications profession to make sure that we're convening these conversations. It's really important. Some people say everybody's a communicator, and indeed they possibly are, but not everyone's a communications professional. They need our counsel, they need our advice, and we should be advocates for what good ESG, CSR, social responsible communication looks like.
I just think, hold your end within an organisation, because there's lots of people with conflicting views and lots of people like to tell PR professionals what to do. we have a wide radar. We watch the issues just by nature of what we do. We see what's going on in the media. We can see the trends, and what we contribute to an organisation and the decisions it makes in terms of where it goes and a whole lot of things, but including this is really, really valuable. So keep speaking up within your organisation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much to our panelists, Debashish, Kaz, Danielle. It's been really, really great to have you join us and to talk about this. If anybody would actually like to hear some more on this topic, there was plug here for the IABC Panellists, the recent one that went out, which was talking about the USC Annenberg polarization report and the work that's come out there. It's their annual report, but they've actually talked about this topic. It's been one that they've been covering for a number of years. It's really, really good. I love their reports. They do great stuff there. So yeah, go and have a listen to the podcast from IABC Podcast. Go and download the report. And yes, thank you very much for joining us again. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.